In this video, we will cover the mute line command in the edit panel of the editing screen, as well as other muting functions. We will look at how to apply the mute line command, which will allow you to mute individual recordings in playback. Plus, we will go over using the mute all command in the navbar, which will allow you to mute all recordings for a character at once. And we will also cover the reduce mute and extend mute functions in the edit panel, which will allow you to adjust the duration of muted recordings to tighten up playback during rehearsal. The muting commands are usually the last edits made to a project because you want to ensure you've memorized your own character's lines before muting any of them. However, once you've memorized all of your own character's lines, you can then apply the mute line command to recordings, which basically allows you to mute the audio for some or all of your character's lines in playback, while all other characters' lines will still be verbalized in the conversation. The purpose of this is so you can practice saying your own character's lines without them actually playing and assisting you in any way. So only the other character's lines will be verbalized to prompt your next line in the script, just as they would if you are performing. To apply the mute line command to recordings, simply press on the mute line icon in the edit panel. It will be highlighted to indicate it is active. Then tap on one or more of the recordings you wish to mute, and they will be highlighted with a dark border to indicate they have been selected. Once you have selected all recordings to mute, press on the mute line icon in the edit panel again to save the change. Now, all selected recordings will be muted in playback.
1, 2. 5, 6. 9, 10.
There are two ways to quickly identify whether a recording in the timeline already has the mute line command applied to it. The first is to look on the left side of the top metallic band. All muted recordings will display the mute line icon in the top metallic band as it moves under the timeline marker. The second way is to press on the mute line icon in the edit panel. This will highlight all previously muted recordings with a dark border around them. However, by doing this, you have activated the mute line selection process, so once you have identified whether the mute line command has already been applied to a recording, you must press on the mute line icon again to deactivate the selection process. When it is deactivated, the dark border will disappear from the selected recordings and the highlight around the icon in the edit panel will disappear. To remove a previously saved mute line command from a recording, all you need to do is repeat the same selection process. Press on the mute line icon in the edit panel. All previously selected recordings will show a dark border around them. Select the recordings to remove the mute command from, and save the change by pressing on the mute line icon again. Now the audio of the deselected recordings will be heard in playback again. Now let's look at the mute all command in the bottom navbar. The mute all command allows you to quickly mute all recordings for a specific character at once. So it is basically doing the same job as the mute line command, but it is muting all recordings for a specific character at the same time, whereas the mute line command will only concentrate on selecting individual recordings one at a time. To mute all recordings for a specific character, just press on the mute all icon in the navbar. The metallic band above the character panel will flash with a prompt instructing you to select a character to mute. When you select a character, the mute icon will appear in the top left corner of the character cell in the character panel. All recordings for that character will now be muted in playback. The mute all command can be removed by repeating the same process. It's also worth noting that the mute all and mute line commands can work together. It may be that you know most of your own character's lines, but there are a few at the end that you still need assistance with, so you can apply the mute all command to your character and then scroll through the timeline to the recording you still need assistance with. Press on the mute line icon in the edit panel. All muted recordings will be highlighted with a dark border around them. Deselect the recordings you still need assistance with, so the dark border will disappear. Then press on the mute line icon again to save the change. Now, only the recordings you want muted will be muted in playback. Let's now look at the reduce mute and extend mute functions in the edit panel. These functions will allow you to adjust the duration of a muted recording to tighten up playback during rehearsal. by either speeding up the muting duration or delaying the muting duration before moving on to the next recording in the timeline. The Reduce Mute command allows you to reduce the time a recording is muted by 1 second intervals. To apply the Reduce Mute command to a recording, press on the Reduce Mute icon in the Edit panel. It will be highlighted to show it is active. Select the recording in the timeline you want to reduce the muting duration of. The recorded cell will be highlighted with a dark border and it will have decreased the time display on the recording by 1 second. Press on the recorded cell for every second the muting should be reduced by during playback and you will see the recording duration decrease. Press on the Reduce Mute command in the Edit panel again to save the change. It is worth noting that by applying the Reduce Mute command to a muted recording, the timeline will play the recorded cell in silence for the reduced time applied to it. Then jump to the next recording.
2 5 6
So, if the timeline appears to jump during playback of a muted recording, it is because the Reduce Mute command has been applied to it. The Extend Mute command allows you to extend the time a recording is muted by 1 second intervals. To apply the Extend Mute command to a recording, the same process applies, but it is increasing the muting duration instead. Press on the Extend Mute icon in the Edit panel. It will be highlighted to show it is active. Select the recording in the timeline you want to extend the muting duration of. The recorded cell will be highlighted with a dark border and it will have increased the time display on the recording by 1 second. Press on the recorded cell for every second the muting should be increased by during playback and you will see the recording duration increase. Press on the Extend Mute command in the Edit panel again to save the change. It's worth noting that by applying the Extend Mute command, the timeline will hold the recorded cell in silence for the extended time applied to it, causing it to pause for the additional time. Then it will move on to the next recording.
6
So if the timeline appears to stop moving after the muted recording has moved under the timeline marker, it is because the Extend Mute command has been applied to it.
9 10
For obvious reasons, the Reduce Mute and Extend Mute functions only work on muted recordings. You cannot alter the duration of a recording that has not been muted. If you want to reset the muting duration back to its original time, press on the mute line icon in the Edit panel, tap on the cell in the timeline to deselect it. The time display will revert to its original duration, then select it again so the dark border reappears and press on the mute line icon again to save the change. Now the recording will be muted again, but with no adjustments to its duration. It's worth noting that the Mute All command in the navbar can also deactivate the Reduce Mute and Extend Mute edits, but if you select the Mute All command again for the same character later, the Reduce and Extend Mute edits will reappear as they were. So if you don't want the previously saved Reduce Mute and Extend Mute edits to be used again, you must reset the muting duration using the Mute Line command. Lastly, if you ever find a recording is not playing for you in the timeline, check whether it has any mute, group or skip line edits applied to it by using the checks mentioned previously. More information on the DialogMaster Pro app can be found on the website at appsuperlative.com or the YouTube channel.